Hola, buenos días. Me llamo Manuel Martínez Sellés y solo unos pocos minutos para dar la bienvenida a todos los asistentes de los muchos actos que tengo el placer de presidir o inaugurar desde que soy presidente del Colegio de Médicos. Este es probablemente uno de los que más ilusión me hace, la reunión del 30 aniversario del estudio BENSTENT o, como todos lo vemos, pues la reunión de homenaje a Carlos Macaya, ¿no? Yo tengo mucho cariño por Carlos, creo que es una persona que ha aportado mucho a la cardiología, sobre todo a la cardiología intervencionista, pero la cardiología en general, y yo diría incluso que a la medicina. Y, por lo tanto, desde el Colegio de Médicos de Madrid es un gran orgullo pues, que hayan elegido nuestra sede para este homenaje. A mí me gustaría destacar de Carlos tres cosas. Yo a Carlos le conozco desde hace mucho porque tuve la suerte de ser estudiante de la Complutense y de elegir el Hospital Clínico cuando él ya estaba allí, y de hecho uno de los motivos por los que elegí cardiología fue todo lo que aprendí esos años en el Hospital Clínico, ¿no? Yo destacaría tres cosas. Lo primero, que ha sido un pionero no solo desde el punto de vista técnico, de eso sabe mucho más la gente que está aquí, porque yo, aunque soy cardiólogo, soy de otro ámbito, no soy cardiólogo intervencionista, pero sí es verdad que él fue un pionero no solo desde el punto de vista técnico, sino también desde el punto de vista de lo que es la gestión, ¿no? Y ahí todas las aportaciones que él ha hecho, no solo al ámbito de la cardiología intervencionista, sino también pues desde sus puestos directivos de la Sociedad Española de Cardiología, de FACME, y muchas de las cosas que seguimos haciendo hoy y muchos de los frutos que hemos visto pues fue gracias a las acciones que él tuvo en su momento. Luego, y yo creo que él ha tenido la gran virtud de saber rodearse de un equipo excelente, ¿no? Y esto es lo que hizo que en su día también en el Hospital Clínico pues fue pionero en muchos ámbitos de la cardiología, se eligió como el primer hospital de cardiología de España, y también es lo que ha conseguido pues que muchos de los que estáis aquí, pues que sois discípulos suyos o que habéis seguido la escuela de lo que él inició, y también muchos de los presidentes que ha tenido la Sociedad Española de Cardiología ha sido pues un poco en el ámbito de las personas que han trabajado con él. Y por último, quiero destacar la búsqueda de la excelencia, ¿no? La búsqueda de la excelencia no solo a nivel de investigación, y ahí está el amplio currículum que tiene Carlos, pero también la búsqueda de la excelencia a nivel asistencial, ¿no? Y todo el recorrido que ha tenido la hemodinámica en España, en Europa, todo lo que podemos hacer hoy en día a los pacientes, las soluciones que se les da desde el punto de vista de cardiología intervencionista a muchas patologías que hace años o décadas eran quirúrgicas, pues todo esto ha sido posible gracias a esta búsqueda de la excelencia, tanto a nivel asistencial como a nivel de investigación. Y bueno, yo solo decir que recuerdo con mucho cariño momentos que he vivido con Carlos. Me acuerdo cuando yo acabé la residencia del Marañón, el único sitio que fui a pedir trabajo fue al Clínico, aunque luego al final me quedé en el Marañón. Y me acuerdo cómo miró Carlos pues, con detenimiento mi currículum. Me acuerdo que él me dijo que él había estado en un colegio mayor. Yo estudié en el Barberán y que él estaba en uno que está al lado, que era el Marqués de la Ensenada. Bueno, todo lo que también que estuvimos trabajando, porque coincidimos cuando él era presidente de la SEC, yo era presidente de la sección de cardiología geriátrica, y pese a su agenda, que era siempre muy complicada, pues él me hacía el favor de venir a las reuniones que hacíamos desde la sección. Bueno, muchas otras anécdotas, con lo cual, pues Carlos creo que es un ejemplo para mí, yo creo que es un ejemplo para muchos de los que estamos aquí. Y bueno, dados simplemente las gracias, sobre todo a Fernando, que haya elegido nuestra sede para hacer la reunión, y bueno, pues poneros a vuestra disposición, y espero que el día de hoy, que ya he visto que va a ser muy denso, pues sea un día que todos podamos agradecerle personalmente a Carlos todo lo que ha aportado. Muchas gracias. Pasamos a la primera mesa, que vamos muy justos de tiempo, con lo cual pasamos a la primera mesa. Muchas gracias.
buenos días a todos y a todas. En primer lugar, muchas gracias a todos por poder estar aquí en este día. We would like to send also a very warm welcome to our colleagues that are coming from other countries to be with us. We know the effort that implies. Just a few words on solamente un par de palabras acerca del evento que hemos organizado para comentarlo. A ver si se ve la diapositiva de la introducción. El evento es un evento que tiene unas características ligeramente distintas a lo que se suele ver en la cultura, digamos, científica española, y está mucho más entroncado con algo que es muy común en la cultura anglosajona, que es lo que se llama el Festschrift, una palabra alemana pero que se utiliza mucho en todo el ámbito anglosajón. Estos son ejemplos de algunos de los Festschrifts que se hacen, que son en principio eventos científicos que giran en torno a la carrera de una persona para de esa forma rememorar de una forma armónica todas las contribuciones que una persona ha hecho. Y por lo tanto podemos decir que hemos diseñado un Festschrift, un simposio de Festschrift para Carlos Macaya. El tema que hemos escogido, el hilo rojo que conecta los eventos, es el desarrollo del stent coronario. Y el motivo para ello es porque en este año se cumple el 30 aniversario del estudio que fue más importante a la hora de demostrar la importancia que tenía el stent coronario, el estudio BENESTENT. En esa época yo estaba trabajando en Rotterdam con el doctor Patrick Serrais, que es el investigador principal, y para mí fue un honor enorme el que de repente Patrick me dijese directamente: este hombre Macaya es increíble, está metiendo una cantidad de pacientes, no sabía que los investigadores españoles eran tan buenos. Bueno, la verdad es que a mí me llenó de orgullo. Patrick a mí no me consideraba tanto español porque yo venía de hacer mi formación en Inglaterra y por lo tanto es algo que a lo mejor también explica, en esta foto en París explica el carácter británico, explica lo de la corbata, pero bueno, es algo que estaba ahí, nos conocíamos desde hacía mucho tiempo y fue, digamos, también es para mí una gran fortuna que, habiéndole conocido antes del estudio BENESTENT, terminase trabajando en su equipo en el Hospital Clínico San Carlos, donde todavía sigo. Y este camino, este viaje del stent continuó con muchas cosas que fueron necesarias introducir y que hoy además tenemos la suerte de contar con nosotros a personas que han sido claves en el desarrollo de estos distintos pasos. Todos los cambios que fueron necesarios realizar en la farmacoterapia para poder utilizar el stent de forma segura. El desarrollo de nuevos stents, los stents liberadores de fármaco, para abordar algunos de los problemas que tenía el stent fundamental. La importancia de la imagen intracoronaria en muchos momentos del desarrollo de la técnica del stent y muchas más cosas, muchas direcciones que siguen y donde Carlos Macaya y el equipo que formó pues han jugado un papel muy importante. Tenemos además la suerte de tener este evento en un ámbito que es excepcional y me gustaría que Fernando comentase un poco acerca de la elección de este lugar.
Sí, muchas gracias, Javier, muchas gracias a todos. La verdad que es fantástico estar aquí porque, bueno, a la hora de elegir el lugar para celebrar esto, pues el que tenga un componente, un simbolismo especial, lo hizo también erguirse como una preferencia. Entonces, este lugar es una antigua aula de medicina del siglo XIX. Se construyó, era el aula de la Facultad de Medicina de San Carlos. Entonces, esto era antes del hospital. Luego se creó el Hospital de San Carlos, el Hospital Clínico de San Carlos, que estaba en el edificio del Reina Sofía, que está aquí al ladito. Y eso fue así durante mucho tiempo hasta que en la República se trasladó a la ciudad universitaria como un megaproyecto de expansión, porque aquí en el centro de Madrid pues ya no podía crecer más, ¿no? Hay un hospital en crecimiento. Entonces este lugar tiene ese punto que nos de alguna manera cierra un círculo con la historia que contamos hoy, que va muy relacionada con el hospital clínico actual, ¿no?
Y por último, Nieves, a lo mejor podías comentar un poco el programa, cómo se va a desarrollar el evento hoy, el Festschrift.
Así es. Bueno, pues en la línea de lo que ha comentado Carlos, el programa es una unión de una parte científica en la que vamos a seguir esa ese desarrollo de la cardiología intervencionista, especialmente de intervencionismo coronario a lo largo de los años, unido a la carrera de Carlos, que está totalmente ligada desde el principio, digamos, del desarrollo de la angioplastia hasta la actualidad. Con lo cual vamos a tener una parte de presentaciones y vamos a tener también una parte más de testimonios personales, de personas que han trabajado con Carlos en distintos aspectos y cómo esto, digamos, ha influido en sus carreras. Seguro que ha sido una persona muy influyente para todos nosotros. Así que sin más preámbulo, vamos a pasar a la primera parte del programa. Y me gustaría invitar a Javier y al doctor José María de la Torre, que van a moderar esta sesión, este primer bloque que se titula El nacimiento de la cardiología intervencionista. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Yo lo primero también quiero hacer mención a un aspecto, y es que como editor de Recent Interventional Cardiology me hace mucha ilusión que hayamos sacado esta separata, Javier, de una revisión fantástica que describe el origen del stent coronario y que afirman Fernando Macaya como primer autor y Carlos Macaya como autor senior, y en el que están también Nieves y Javier. Y haber aportado una colaboración, ¿verdad?, para que esto estuviera en tiempo me hace mucha ilusión. Entonces, Javier, vamos a empezar ahora un poquito esta sesión en la que tenemos invitados internacionales, también alguno nacional, y bueno, te paso la palabra. Bueno, la verdad es que pensamos que no podía haber mejor invitado para participar en este FESScript, para comenzar, que el profesor Jean Marcó, a quien une además con Carlos una profunda amistad. El problema es que Jean Marcó en este momento está ingresado en un hospital con un problema de salud que está llevando un cierto tiempo, y puedo testimoniar que, vamos, que ha hecho todo lo posible para poder estar con nosotros, pero finalmente ha encontrado una solución que consiste, en primer lugar, en mandar unas palabras para Carlos Macaya que voy a leer, y a continuación hacer su presentación, que ha sido grabada, y os explicaremos cómo es. Entonces, bueno, en castellano os lo leo para que lo he traducido. Querido Carlos, siento mucho no poder estar contigo en este día que concluye tu larga y fructífera carrera desde Canarias hasta Madrid. Tengo perfectamente presente la primera vez que nos vimos en Madrid con Alfonso, me imagino que es con Alfonso Medina. Me admiró mucho tu habilidad y elegancia en el manejo de los doble coronas. Posteriormente, tus conferencias e intercambios cara a cara, durante tus conferencias e intercambios cara a cara, aprecié mucho tu ética a la hora de transmitir la información y el rigor científico combinado con tu humildad natural, que han hecho de ti un gran maestro. Aprendí mucho de ti durante nuestros encuentros, unos intercambios que me permitieron madurar y enriquecer personalmente. Gracias por ello. Te deseo lo mejor en esta nueva etapa de la vida, espero que sigas activo y tener la oportunidad de compartir contigo nuevamente un gran momento alrededor de un doble coronas y un brandy. Que pases un buen día con tus amigos. Un gran abrazo, Jean Marcó. Y como digo, pues lo que hemos hecho es preparar un vídeo que él ha grabado y que creo que va a realmente revelar toda la importancia que ha tenido Jean, ¿no? Sí, en la carrera, como gran educador, como gran clínico. La semana pasada fue el PCR, tenemos a nuestra directora, Nieves Gonzalo, más de 12.000 asistentes, es el gran curso de intervencionismo mundial, y Jean Marcó fue prácticamente quien comienza ese curso. Luego Patrick fue una parte importante de él, Carlo también, pero Jean Marcó fue él estaba ya en las fotos de los primeros cursos de Zurich de angioplastia del 79. Muy bien, pues vamos a ver todo esto en el vídeo que hemos preparado.
My main goal is to share with you what message I retain from different meetings and friendly exchange with Andreas Granzik and Richard Meiler, who were my mentors and friends, and some reflection on a story alive with a patient. From Charles Dotter method to balloon angioplasty. In 1963, Charles Dotter proved that atheromatoma plaque can be compressed by inserting two coaxial plastic tubes, the Dotter effect. And he wrote a very visionary sentence. On January 16, 1964, he performed the first interventional transhumeral angioplasty by using his method. Interventional radiology was born.
Here, the first look shows the stenosis. Now to thread the guide through it, always under fluoroscopy and with care. The patient watches. This time it practically fell through. It's not always this easy.
It looks like we have it made. Yeah, looks good, but let's not count our chickens for another day or so.
He understood the limit of the tools, but he did find any support to develop new tools. For the vascular surgeon community, there was no future for this technique. In 1965, he tried to dilate an iliac artery stenosis by using the Fogarty ambulatory balloon. He concluded that this compliant balloon was not suitable. Everard Zeitler was convinced by the Dotter method, and he performed the first peripheral angioplasty in 1968 and started teaching the technique in Europe. Anders Grunzig, fellow in the radiology department in Zurich, visited Everard Zeitler in 1971 to learn the Dotter method. In December 1971, with the help of Everard, Andreas performed the first femoral angioplasty during the Dotter methods. Unfortunately, it was followed by a distal embolization into the popliteal artery. These three pioneers share the same vision. The coaxial catheter exerts a longitudinal force on the vessel wall. The application of a radial force seems more appropriate. A flexible catheter with a non-compliant balloon on the distal part can be inflated at high pressure, while keeping the predefined diameter could be the appropriate tool. A non-compliant balloon had to be found. Charles Dotter in US and Zeitler in Germany faces skepticism of the medical community. No future for this technique. No company expressed interest in this project. Between 1972 and 1975, with the support and the confidence of a cardiac surgeon, Eck Senning, Andreas was able to continue treating patients with the Dotter techniques by engaging in the following working axes: commitment, determination to resist adversity, teamwork approach, strong work ethic, continuous quest for improvement by a critical analysis of all the results. He established a collaboration with a retired chemistry doctor who suggests using PVC as high rigidity material. Progressively, step by step, failure after failure, he succeeded in building manually a flexible single lumen catheter with as a distal part a non-compliant balloon reaching a predefined maximum length and diameter for a pressure of 4 atmospheres. The first human balloon angioplasty was carried out by him on February 12, 1974, to dilate a femoral artery critical stenosis. For the next 2.5 years, each balloon catheter will be custom-made for each individual patient. Let's move now to the second step. Andreas had a clear vision on his main goal and ambition: balloon angioplasty to treat patients presenting stenosis on the proximal segment of the coronary arteries. He clearly defined the working axis to achieve this goal. First, get an adequate double lumen catheter, one to inflate the balloon, another to distally perfuse the artery. He found the assistance of a starter, Schneider company, who conceived and built manually a double-lumen balloon catheter, which was tested in Leac artery in January 75. Andreas possessed the device that will allow him to realize his dream. He asked to Felix Müller in Bern to perform angioplasty using this balloon catheter. And the second point was to evaluate the feasibility and safety in animals by addressing these two key questions. What happened when obstructing coronary artery during 10 to 20 seconds? And what about the risk of dissection of rupture of the plaque? Again, a cardiac surgeon, Marco Turina, trusted Andreas and created a model of coronary stenosis in dogs to test coronary balloon angioplasty. The result was presented in 1976 during the American Heart Association meeting as a poster format. It was for me the opportunity to make the first contact with Andreas and Richard Miller from San Francisco. Two major issues have been clearly identified: the intimal dissection and hemorrhage, and the healing process with neointimal cell proliferation. But what about the risk of distal embolization when applying balloon inflation in human coronary atherosclerotic stenosis? The teamwork approach was a key to find an answer. Thanks to the collaboration of Elias Hanna, cardiac surgeon in the St. Mary Hospital in San Francisco, Richard Miller invited Andreas to explore this issue by performing intraoperative balloon dilatation of the coronary artery. In May 1977, they demonstrated the feasibility of coronary balloon angioplasty in vivo and the absence of peripheral debris embolization.
Weil in einem Meeting hier im Universitätsspital hat man darüber diskutiert, ob Andreas eine Koronardilatation durchführen könne oder nicht. Und die meisten waren dann sehr skeptisch und haben gesagt, ja, wenn dann etwas passiert und so.
Andreas then met Eliane Kalepa, the wife of Hugo Schneider, recently graduated from a business school, who was looking to develop innovations. Andreas' determination, rigor, and work approach make her enthusiastic and convinced. The small Swiss startup became Schneider Meditech in 1977, and the double lumen balloon catheter was patented under the name of Tilaka Balloon DG2030 Granzy catheter.
We started in a garage. We had a production of 10 people, and of course there was no clean room. We made about 5 catheters a week, and we were not allowed to sell one catheter to a doctor which didn't show us a certificate from Andreas Grünzig, a training certificate. So of course we had a window in this garage and we opened it, we gave the catheter and we wanted cash, Swiss francs. Not US dollars, no checks.
This vision and this company together made it possible to manufacture appropriate device. In September 1977, Bernie Meyer presented a 30-year-old man with an nasal stenosis on an LED and who had accepted to be the first patient treated with a new technique. Again, the surgeon was okay with the initiative. Do it. If something happens, I will operate.
Dass es überhaupt machen konnte. Ich glaube, ohne die Worte von Professor Senning hätte die Möglichkeit zum damaligen Zeitpunkt überhaupt nicht gehabt.
And in collaboration with Bernie Meyer, he successfully performed the first PTCA. Andreas became aware that his dream came true. He called Richard Miller and said, I've done it. PTCA technique was born.
Das war am Abend vor einem Eingriff, als ich im Spitalbett gelegen bin. Hat sich der Dr. Grünzig bei mir vorgestellt und hat gesagt, er will mit mir etwas diskutieren, aber ich könnte zu ihm aufs Büro. Und dann bin ich dort hingegangen und er hat mit mir da ausführlich das diskutiert, was er im Sinne zu machen. Und dann hat man das skizziert, aufgezeichnet, erklärt, was eine Bypass-Operation ist und was er würde machen, die Dilatation. Er hat es noch nie gemacht an einem Menschen. Er hat allerdings schon Tierversuche gemacht, an Hunden, Affenversuche. Und das ist immer sehr gut gegangen. Bei Menschen haben wir den ähnlichen Eingriff schon gemacht in den Beinarterien. Haben wir dort auch schon Stenosen so aufmachen können. Aber am Herz haben wir es an einem menschlichen Herz noch nie versucht. Und ich wäre also der erste Patient auf der ganzen Welt, der jetzt das einmal probieren möchte. Und der Grund, warum er gerade direkt an mich gelangt, ist, weil ich jung und kräftig.
40 years later, this third patient, in excellent condition, came in Paris with Benny Miller to celebrate the 40th anniversary. But the head of the cardiology department were hesitant to let him proceed with the PTCA technique. He had to wait more than 2 months to get the second patient referred. Andreas actually performed 2 other PTCA in Zurich and a full patient in Frankfurt by Martin Kattenbach. To prove the reproducibility, procedure were performed alternatively in Zurich and in Frankfurt. Richard Myler in San Francisco, Simon Sturzer in New York performed the first case on the same days. After our presentation and publication of the result, teaching the technique was a new challenge and dilemma. Due to the opposition from the cardiology community, it was important to disseminate the technique with wisdom. And Andreas innovated again. He launched the concept of live demonstration course.
So here's the pressure. What's the height? What? Then what? Then you stop, yes. And a lot of people have shown this now around us. You cited them as well in your paper. And now you come with your hypothesis that we will name it science. If it's really a large artery, then I would start with the G. Könnten Sie mit Ihnen, Dr. Stanford, Chief of Cardiology of Journal.
While sharing his enthusiasm, Andreas insists on the patient selection, protocol, and the need for sufficient training before embarking. He considered that engaging in a systematic clinical evaluation process was essential for continuous improvement. He talked about failure as much as success. Each failure or complication must be analyzed with honesty, objectivity, and shared with peers as a key learning. The protocol consists in the following. After systematic administration of intracoronary nitrate, the feature of the lesion has to be drawn on paper on 2 orthogonal projections. The pressure gradient had to be checked after closing the lesion. And after inflation and deflation of the balloon, the success was defined as a residual stenosis less than 20% and no pressure gradient. I traveled several times to Zurich. Andreas was always been very welcoming, sharing reflection upon failure and complication, analyzed with honesty and objectivity.
And I didn't appreciate on that study how awkward the orifice of the left vein was. It was an unusual orifice.
But we have the impression that we can stop the extension and that we can stop.
He shared the tips and hints he had learned from previous experience. Richard Myler welcomed me to San Francisco for 2 months. All the first day, we reflect on all the complication and failure, with self-critical comments on the error, and with a comment of Elias Hanna, the cardiac surgeon. In 1980, Andreas invited all the center to share their result with honesty. The success rate was only 66%. 10% acute occlusion requiring urgent coronary bypass surgery. 1.5% of mortality. What should we do? How to improve this result? To share the failure with peers, to learn from each other seemed essential to him. Andreas solicited participants to objectively present their failure in order to gain positive information and learn key lessons for the future. In front of Masson's sons, he invited me to express critical reflection on coronary dissection, and afterward, they gave a constructive remark to the audience. In October 1980, Andreas moved to Atlanta. The message I keep for this friendly exchange is to engage in a continuous quest for improvement by taking into account the systematic critical analysis of failure, sharing them with peers, and learning from the experience of others. Of course, an improvement of the device was required.
For most of our problems at the present time, the balloon catheter is quite a good answer. But the more we depart, as I said, to more diffuse disease, the more we have to change our directions to additional catheter systems. Catheters or instruments which then could solve problems like getting rid of a dissection which is like a flap hanging in the lumen obstructing the blood flow. Catheters who are able to eliminate embolizations, plaques, thrombi, etc. So we have to have more armamentarium than the balloon catheter only. We need more than that.
John Simpson developed a new catheter system, a coaxial stable guide wire with a very low profile balloon. 1982 in Toulouse, John presented the first clinical results. At the end of a 2-hour debate on a coaxial over-the-wire technique versus double lumen balloon with a pre-shaped distal wire, cardiologists from Europe and US conclude that the coaxial guide wire technique has a niche for approximately 10–15% of the procedure. A few years later, it was used in 100%. This is when I learned to be cautious before expressing a negative point of view in the potential future of an innovation. Between 1982 and 1985, Jeff Archler expanded the education on elderly, on patients with acute coronary syndrome, primary angioplasty in acute phase of MI, patients with multi-vessel disease or multiple stenosis, treated during one procedure by using a very low profile balloon with a tapered wire. In March 1985, during the ACC meeting, a debate on this topic took place in a full auditorium. Examples of complex procedures were presented by Jeff Archler. Multiple lesion, distal lesion in one procedure, resolution of an occlusive dissection by plunge or rapidly repeat balloon inflation with a spectacular skill. The patient's safety was Andreas' top priority. He recommended only dilating a single lesion on a vessel. On a patient with 2 vessel disease, a staging approach, starting with the most critical lesion and 1 day later ensuring that the result is good before proceeding to the second dilatation. Richard Miller invited us, Andreas, Simon, Sturzer and I, to spend the weekend following this meeting in San Francisco. During a dinner, Andreas expressed the following comment: Jeff is very strong. I am not capable of doing what he has shown, and few cardiologists can claim to do it. Nevertheless, I am convinced that Jeff's intuition to broaden the indication on patients with acute coronary syndrome, multi-vessel disease, or complex lesion is the future of the technique. However, currently, if the cardiologists who don't have the same skill try to extend the indication for such patients, the complication rate will destroy the future of this still controversial technique. Our responsibility is to teach how to address challenge step by step, starting with simple lesion, in always placing the patient at the center and not a personal skill. A rigorous evaluation of the extension of the technique on patients with multivessel disease or more complex lesion is mandatory. Anders died on October 27, 1985. The improvement of the balloon catheter technology with lower profile adapted balloon catheter allowed to extending the indication of balloon angioplasty both to coronary and peripheral disease, including iliac, femoral, popliteal, and renal stenosis. In 1986, a German cardiologist patented a motorized system, later named by the US company as rapid exchange. It became the reference technique for balloon and other associated techniques. We can sum up the key message for this period as follows. We need to build our project by engaging in the following action. 1, commitment and determination. 2, teamwork. 3, strong work ethic. And 4, a continued case for improvement by critically analyzing results.
Imágenes y fotografías, o vídeos incluso que no habíamos visto, pero como comentaba Andreas Gnussi, que había mucho por hacer, porque los resultados, pues hombre, eran un poco limitados, ¿no? Y ese hacer era, sin duda alguna, el stent, que es el siguiente paso. Pues para hablar del nacimiento del stent tenemos hoy a Patrick Serres, que es de sobrísima conocido, pero hay que presentar. Ya sabéis que él dirigió durante muchos años la cardiología intervencionista en el Rotterdam, en el Thorax Center de Rotterdam. Patrick, I am introducing you. Un centro que ha formado a los que han sido luego muy líderes del intervencionismo en toda Europa y en el mundo. Ha sido el gran promotor de ensayos y trials, desde los stent convencionales, farmacoactivos, absorbible. Él tiene un enorme número de trials, de estudios, de investigación, que continúa realizando desde Irlanda, desde Galway, ahora, en un centro de desarrollo de ensayos. El PCR ha presentado más ensayos todavía. Y bueno, Patrick tiene un índice H de más de 200. I am telling to the audience, Patrick, you're totally well known by all of them, but I'm doing a short bio about you, which is well known. But I'm saying that you are still very active in trialists. You are doing trials, not only in coronary, but in structural as well. And this has been so for 40 years, from the very beginning, from the Beneston, and still, you are still so active with the new developments, new techniques. Absolutely fantastic to see you how encouraging the young investigators to do all these clinical trials. Then we're going to talk about the stents, and we have to talk about you because you and stent has the same history. And please, Patrick, the stage is yours.
It was quite emotional to look at this wonderful video. And when Carlos asked me to talk about the past, I accept, although I never do that. I mean, always talking about the future. But for him, I made an exception because he's a remarkable individual, and we went together to an important phase of the interventional cardiology. So the title is The Advent of Coronary Stenting. And this is what the people have forgot. This is 2 post-mortem of human. On the left-hand side, the patient died immediately after the procedure. And you could see the mechanism of balloon angioplasty. You fracture, you rupture the intima. There is a kind of dehiscence of the intima from the media. And that's what we do again. We do again with the drug-coating balloon. In the drug-coating balloon, we have shown with OCT that 95% of the effect of the drug-coating balloon is this. And then you see in another patient who died 4 months later, and you can still see the edge of the flap, but the dissection and the lumen has been filled by proteoglycan, and that's what we call restenosis. So many of us was dreaming about what we call initially a scaffold. The term stent was not existing. You see again on the left-hand side the result of balloon angioplasty in one patient, dissection and intraparietal hemorrhage. And then on the right-hand side, if you look carefully, you could see there is one point at 9 o'clock, which is the ruptures, minimal, but it could be giant. And then you have the struts, which is scaffolding that dissection. Now, I have reported that era in the book of Michel Bertrand, which was endorsed by the European Society of Cardiology. It's called The Evolution of Cardiac Catheterization and Interventional Cardiology. And today I will use the writing to describe what Carlos and myself have done in that period. Wallsten, not Wallstent, but Wallsten was a young, rich Swedish engineer. He retired in Switzerland and became the neighbor of Charlie Chaplin on the Lake Le Mans. And Wallsten met at a social party one of his compatriots, Aachen Senning, so important in the interventional cardiology, a prominent congenital surgeon working in Zurich, the father of the so-called Senning operation and the pioneer of the pacemaker implantation, indeed the first. And Senning was concerned by the high mortality of acute surgery in patients suffering acute dissection of the ascending and descending aorta. Wallsten proposed an ingenious mechanical device. It was a double helix of metal, which could be introduced percutaneously and would scaffold the dissection flap of the aorta. And in the summer 1985, the design was miniaturized by Christian Humbert, a brilliant engineer, so that it could be used in peripheral vessel and ultimately in coronary arteries. In February 1986, I met Jacques Pouel in Toulouse during one of our numerous cardiology meetings, and at that particular meeting, he told me confidentially about one of his new endeavors, implantation of metallic endoluminal self-expanding prosthesis in the femoral arteries of goats. At about the same time, I found a leaflet on my desk announcing an angioplasty course in Lausanne in June, organized by Ulrich Sigwart, and the topic was stented angioplasty. Being rather ignorant of the subtleties of the English language, I was puzzled by the meaning of the word stent, since Jacques Pouel has not mentioned stent, but only metallic endoprosthesis. To my surprise, I could not find the word stent in a simple, conventional dictionary, and I had to refer to Webster Dictionary, which was also not rather unclear on the significance and the origin of the word. In April 1986, Paul Huguenols, my boss, and I made an appointment with the Medivent company in Lausanne, and you see there the so-called Wallsten self-expanding stent. All this year, we were struggling with bleeding complication. We had to give heparin, persantin, sulfenperazone, dextran, aspirin, and antivitamin K. You can imagine the result, and you have there a great example of a post-procedure. And I'm not mentioning the gastric hemorrhage and the retroperitoneal bleeding. At that time, we published an editorial in the European Heart Journal, Are We the Sorcerer's Apprentice? Reflecting our increasing doubt about the applicability of this therapy and the problem of anticoagulation post-stenting. Reluctance against this type of therapy was obvious, and a stent patient was considered almost as complicated as a heart transplant patient by the nursing staff. In 1987, a formal working party on the wall stent was created. Tony Rickards, Michel Bertrand, Bernie Meyer, Ulrich Sigwart, and Jacques Pouel. And it was decided to pool our patients, not more than 100. And Marie-Angèle Morel, which is in the audience, who was appointed project coordinator, used a charm and succeeded in bringing back a huge suitcase from Lausanne containing all the cine film out of case treated by Ulrich Sigwart. And for her, it was the beginning of an international career. And that was important to have the film of Ulrich Sigwart because the other participants have done small number, 5, 6, 7, 10, but not the number that has been treated in Lausanne. That was the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. You see the name that I have just mentioned, including Ulrich Sigwart and Jean-Jacques Bois and Bernie Meyer. And we had done altogether 105 patients. And look at the table on the right-hand side. Out of these 105 patients, there were 8 deaths. 8 deaths. 3 sudden at 48 hours, 11 days, and 1.5 months. And there were 3 stent occlusion, less than 24 hours, 2 days, and 8 days. And the occlusion of the device, acute and chronic, was seen in 23 stents. 1/4 of this device get occluded. Now, in his book, Julio Palmas, he with his wife, and he has a wonderful vineyard by now, wrote a book called Inventing the Stent, the Joy and Pain of Developing a Breakthrough Device. And he said in that book, Serrais published this finding in the New England Journal of Medicine in January 1991, accompanied by an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine by a well-respected American cardiologist, Peter Block, who criticized all the stents, including the Palmas shots. And he said in the New England editorial, the development of this device has resembled the mating of elephants, carried out on a high level and associated with much noise and trumpeting, with the result not evident for 2 years and the product not perfect. And indeed, 2 years is the pregnancy time of duration of the elephant. As a self-criticism, I even made a slide of these scientific comments stemming from the New England Journal of Medicine. Research in interventional cardiology is like love making between elephants. It is carried out on a high plane. There is a lot of noise and trumpeting, and nothing comes out for 2 years. This publication triggered a wave of critical comment. There was a lot of subacute thrombose was the news, and a lot of sensation was part of the story. But I think the superficial readers overlooked the fact that the restenosis rate was 14%. If you could see this small red block there, that's the case with restenosis more than 50%. But otherwise, there was a message there. And I felt guilty about the aftermath of the publication, And the following years, I did my best to reassess the value of the Palma Schatz stent. This is in the book of Julio Palmas. He said, copper wire and solder materials, both at the local Radio Shack store, provide the means to build crude prototype of the stent in my garage. And you see one example here. Another one, you could see the place where he has been soldering the metal. And he told me that he was basically inspired by chicken wire stent. And when I was talking to my Dutch patient, I was always using that term in Dutch, chicken wire. So the first Palma Schatz stent in human was in December 31st. It was in the place of Eduardo Souza. You see Amanda Souza next to her husband. In the middle, you have Julio Palmas, Schatz, and behind there was Fausto Ferres that I saw again at the PCR last week. At the moment of the procedure, the vessel was occluded. So they waited a little bit too long, and the very severe lesion became occluded. But the result of the stent was great. So let's go back to the Netherlands and start the Benestent saga, in which Carlos has been so much associated. So in 19, the result of the first 200 patients treated with the Palma Schatz in the Netherlands were reported with great honesty by my Dutch colleagues, and it appears that the results were a mixed bag of great successes, but also great catastrophes. Some of the skeptical mind in our Dutch cardiological community suggest that this registry should lead to a randomized trial. I took their words literally at heart and started to design a protocol for a randomized trial, which, after toying with Nebe stent, not very trendy, you will agree with that, we decided to call Benestent, as it was to involve initially cardiologists from Belgium and the Netherlands. The next picture is a montage of 30 years ago, so I'm not so sure that you are going to recognize everybody there. There was Aken Emanuelson, Victor Legrand, Pim de Feytre, Bernard de Bruyne. In French, we have Nicolas Donchin, Yves Juillard, Jorge Belardi from Argentine, Antonio Colombo, Eduardo Souza, Daniel Matern, Sigwart, Ari Surapanata, Eric Eckhout, Jean-Jacques Gois, Chris Buller, and Peter de Jager. And there at the top, there is a young man called Carlos Macaya Miguel. And that's what we achieved together, is a New England, but look carefully. The paper was accepted, I think, because there was a 10% in re-PTCA. You can see the percentage, 23 versus 13.5. That was something new. But if you look at the QCA, it's very sobering, because the difference between the MLD balloon and the MLD stent was 90 micron, 90 micron. And the p-value is 0.09, even not significant. The net gain is 0.65 and 0.75, again, 100 micron of difference. So statisticians are very important people in our life. They convert this 0.09 in 0.03 for the difference in minimal lumen diameter between the two study groups at follow-up then the pre-intervention lumen and vessel size, respectively, were used as covariate. That was the trick. Now, Benestand 1 was finished in '94, and my next memory is transcatheter TCT in '94 in the main arena, where during a keynote address I predicted that by the year 2000, stent would be used in more than 90% of our patients. And there was a murmur of discontent and disbelief among the audience. But the PRESTO study with 11,000 patients, complete in '99, that's 5 years later, revealed that the use of stent in 555 stents, that's the biggest randomized trial that I have done in my life, in 550 centers. And then the number of stent use, the stent was used in 89%. And if you look at the curve there, you could see that in 2004, there was 1 million of patients treated with the stent, thanks to the action of Carlos and others. He was the best recruiter. You have seen that on one slide. So Carlos is a charming gentleman. And beside Benestand study, Carlos and Marie-Angèle had many common interests, such as football, FC Barcelona, which is quite iconoclastic if you are in Madrid, yeah, and Koeman, of course, which was the coach of the FC Barcelona, and he's Dutch. Since Benestand, Carlos and I have never stopped to work together, and this is a trial that we have done together: FLAIR, Finesse 2, Velvet, Bridge, Arts 1, Arts 2, Spirit 2, Seismic, Syntax, Resolute, All Comers, Absorb 2, and Excel, and examination with Manel. Yeah? We published together 26 PubMed major publications. In November 2018, I was made Doctor Honoris Causa of the Complutense University of Madrid. Carlos was instrumental in engineering this honorific degree, and I will be forever grateful for that. This is the medal that I receive, and your medal, Carlos, is a permanent symbol of your presence in my office, together with pictures of my team, a DG Grünzig balloon catheter, a Palma Schatz, and picture of the people that I love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That's a fantastic journey through all the development of the stent. And now we have the pleasure to invite someone who also has very strong connections with you and also with us, Professor Carlo Di Mario from Italy. So, Carlo, I met Carlo when I became part of your team in Rotterdam. Carlo was already there at the time that I arrived, but he continued working for time in the Thorax Center, and then subsequently he moved to work with another legend in the field of coronary stenting, that is Antonio Colombo, who actually was instrumental, perhaps as probably Carlos will tell us, in improving the technique of stenting and ensuring that it could be applied safely. Also from the point of view of pharmacotherapy, we will speak about that. So it's a pleasure to having you with us, Carlo, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. It's not easy to speak after my mentor, Patrick Serrais, and after such a nice, emotional talk. But I'm very pleased to be in this room to celebrate a person who obviously is leaving a great legacy to Spanish cardiology in general and deserves to be among the great physicians that are in this historical room. So, thank you for asking me to speak of a subject dear to me, which is intravascular imaging. And as Javier already alluded to, I also trained in Rotterdam. That's where everything started for intravascular imaging. In 1984, Professor Bohm, Klaas Bohm, you see him with Håkan Emanuelsson, developed an intracardiac catheter, and then this was further miniaturized to be able to be used in a peripheral and then coronary vessel. Was still a device without a wire. Patrick remembers very well the Dumed company. So we used it in animal experiments. We used for in vitro comparison. You see in the Thorax Center Journal that the big buildings around the hospital and the university are made in the shape of an intravascular image, and we presented the result. You see me with Marie-Angèle Morel preparing in Patrick's office our talks for American Heart Association in Anaheim. However, these were not catheters applicable in human coronary arteries. And in the history of intravascular ultrasound, probably Stanford has to be remembered as the cradle of this technique. Neves is now one of the main protagonists of EuroPCR. I noticed at the third floor a long list of milestones in the history of balloon angioplasty and stenting. There is laser. The last one is the application of intravascular lithotripsy. There is nothing about intravascular imaging, Doppler, and OCT, and I think this needs to be implemented. 1989, Paul Yock, I'm pleased I spent a month with him and Peter Fitzgerald in Stanford in 1995, was the first to develop a catheter with a rotating mirror against which the crystal could fire the ultrasound deflected to the wall, generating these high resolution circumferential images. And then there were phase array catheters developed by Hodgkin and others. And using these commercial devices, we were able, using the expertise that was present at the Thorax Center in the Department of Echocardiography, led by Professor Ruland, and you see here with Professor Elber, and in a festive setting with myself in Sardinia, we were the first to demonstrate in vivo the phenomenon of Glagovian remodeling on this 3D reconstruction. You clearly see the lumen in red, which remains unchanged. Angiography doesn't show the presence of this heavily remodeled soft plaque. And then we used this technology to perform volumetric measurements of plaque dimensions with this brilliant Chinese engineer, with a German doctor. This is his PhD thesis, Clemens Vorbirkelen, and this was the basis for a lot of what you are going to see in the future in terms of ability of intravascular imaging to check outcome after various pharmacological intervention to fight the process of atherosclerosis. However, the main application that was clinically successful of intravascular imaging was in the field of stenting. So I think it's appropriate that this is mentioned in this meeting about the BEME stent. And you see here a young Ulrich Sigwart at the time of the first implantation of his wall stent, and a few years later, last year, when he honored us by his presence at one of our grand rounds in Florence. And a bit the history of what Patrick summarized, the dissection as the Achilles heel of PTCA, recoil as the main phenomenon leading to restenosis, and the advantage of stents to defeat in part both, with the following step being the use of drugs eluted by the stent to reduce intimal hyperplasia. So you have seen the results of Benestent. As always, humbly, Patrick said, well, the difference in minimal lumen diameter and percent stenosis was not that much, but still was a 30 to 20% event rate at 1 year in favor of stenting. In part, however, with this Damocles sword of the increased risk of thrombosis. And you see in the publication also discussed by Patrick about the wall stent, how many of these patients died suddenly or had a myocardial infarction because of the development of thrombosis. And here comes intravascular imaging and the idea of my second mentor, Antonio Colombo, with whom I worked in Milan for 8 years, 1995-2003, and his idea, with the help of John Tobis, at that time the intertherapy system, that a main player in the process of stent thrombosis was the fact that deploying stent at the normal pressure we were using at the time, 6, 8, 10 atmospheres, we still left areas of stent unopposed and unexpanded. And you see how the result becomes different when you use higher pressure and more appropriate balloons. I tried, a bit the school of Patrick, to confirm this in a randomized trial, but of course I'm not the stamina of my great teacher and master. And when I did this Opticus trial with Harold Mudra, 550 patients, probably was too early. You see how little is the change from the ultrasound to the angiography group in terms of the maximal pressure applied, 14.8, 14.1, and the size of the balloon, just a meager 0.1. And this was the outcome. There was no difference in terms of event or in terms of restenosis. Not unexpected, because we could achieve our goal that was still quite conservative, 80% of the 90% of the mean reference lumen area, or 100% of the smaller reference, normally the distal one, only in 56% of cases. And from that moment on, I felt that teaching how to use ultrasound was the most important point. And I had the fortune to work with Patrick in some of these courses. I organized courses at the Heart House. I came a few times to the course of Eloygio Garcia here, in Gregorio Marañón in Madrid. And that's where I met Carlos 3 weeks ago at the course organized by Javier Escanet, also on intravascular imaging. And just going and Googling his name and Divus, there are tens of publications in the field. And you see here discussing the new advances in interventional cardiology and in particular imaging, and high-profile papers. This is in JCC with Nieves Gonzalez, Javier Escanet, and Fernando Alfonso, and some very new assessment being so brave to use not only IVUS but also OCT to demonstrate spontaneous coronary dissections. It took some more time to get to demonstrate that intravascular imaging is clinically effective and improves patient outcome. It took, I believe, 2 things. One was understand how to use it. Second was drug-eluting stents. When you are able with those to somehow freeze the result of the initial procedure, the improved gain obtained with stenting, you can obtain a better outcome. You saw in the previous slide that an absolute minimum luminal area was used as additional criteria. This was the first demonstration, not yet in a randomized trial, but in a large series of patients, that when you do intravascular ultrasound, definite or probable stent thrombosis is reduced from 1% to 0.6%, and the MACE events from 4.7 to 3.1 in 74% of the times the operators were using the ultrasound information to do additional intervention, mainly increasing the stent size, expanding the stent. And then 2018 came this large Chinese trial, Ultimate, confirming at 3 years a difference between 6.6 in the intravascular ultrasound group and 10.7 in the angiography-only guidance group, more than 1,600 patients. Those 3 criteria that you see, a plaque burden at the extremities of the stent of less than 50%, appropriate expansion, and absence of dangerous dissection at the edges. When these 3 criteria were met, the event rate was as low as 4.2%. If you do the IVUS, but you are unable to correct the problems that you see, the event rate was similar to the one with angiographic guidance. Putting together long lesion in this trial with a very large Korean trial of long lesions, you have a 3-year follow-up showing this large difference in incidence of cardiac death, significant in the composite of cardiac death, MI, and stent thrombosis. This is another OCT trial in a very challenging scenario, bifurcation lesion, again positive. I won't read the number because of the time. A randomized trial, also from the very active Spanish interventional cardiac community, confirming that in left-main disease, intravascular ultrasound improves prognosis. 10 years outcome in this large registry series from Korean authors, defining which are the endpoint in terms of area that you have to achieve at the various points across the left main bifurcation to obtain an optimal, long-lasting result with imaging. And again, a large Korean study, Renovate Complex PCI, presented last year at American College of Cardiology in complex lesion, calcified, chronic occlusion, in-stent restenosis, left main again, with OCT and IVUS doing better than angiography, with a reduction of around 5 points in the combined endpoints. A meta-analysis presented in the main arena at the European Congress of Cardiology in Amsterdam last year, put together 20 randomized trials or OCT of IVUS against angiography. It's a complex network meta-analysis that includes many patients. I limited data to the direct comparison, IVUS OCT versus angiography, without going into the nuances of the network meta-analysis. 17 trials, 11,000 patients. You see that an important endpoint for our patient, cardiac death, is halved, 0.54 risk reduction. And this didn't include a very recent trial, more than 3,000 patients, Chinese, but not only, New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia in general, in acute coronary syndrome. Most of the previous trials were in stable condition, and you see again that when you achieve the optimal criteria, in this case including also left main disease of expansion, you have a target vessel failure of 3.2% at 1 year versus 7% for angiographic guidance, or when the IVUS criteria are not met. So I hope that when we will hear in London this year at the ESC Congress, the new guidelines, there will be a change to class 1 indication. There is overwhelming evidence, in my view, that intravascular imaging should be used in every patient to improve outcome of stent implantation and in general of our interventions, including acute coronary syndrome, where since you are there, why don't you have a look also to other segments of the vessel? What ultrasound have shown is that it is very effective in showing changes in plaque volume and composition as a response to, for instance, high doses of statins. In this case, the lumen doesn't change in size, but the plaque shrinks. The reversal trial was the first. Steve Nissen inaugurated in this direction. You see that for the first time you have a minus in terms of changes in plaque area. Plaque always increased, also with low-dose statins like pravastatin, 2.7% after 18 months. Here you have for the first time the minus sign, but still a meager 0.4 reduction. You need more detailed, high-resolution methods like OCT to see, like in this case from the Huygens study that we enrolled in Florence, an increased thickness of the fibrous cap that isolate the lipid lake from the lumen and reduces the risk of acute coronary syndrome. And this was confirmed in the main trial. You see the placebo that in fact is high dose statins achieved anyway some increase in fibrous thickness in this patient with acute coronary syndrome and reduction of maximal lipidic arc, but this was far greater in the group receiving the more powerful evolocumab. If you use in addition to intravascular ultrasound, which is near-infrared spectroscopy, able to semi-quantitatively assess the amount of cholesterol in the vessel wall, you see that the patient having a greater than 400 maximal LCBI 4 millimeters, so maximal amount of cholesterol in the plaque, have a worse outcome over 3 years' time, and this is our lipid-rich plaque study. But if you intervene with alirocumab, a similar drug to the one discussed before, PCSK9 inhibitor, you do have a reduction in the amount of cholesterol, minus 79%, a reduction in the amount of inflammation, macrophages, increase in fibrous cap thickness, reduction in atheroma volume, studying patient soon after an acute coronary syndrome with all these imaging techniques. There is a recent trial, just reported, American College of Cardiology 2024, showing that when you have an intermediate plaque with no ischemia, FFR greater than 0.80, when the lumen is as small as 4.0 millimeters square, plaque burden is large, greater than 70%, and there is a thin cap fibroatheroma or a large amount of lipids, placing a stent, something that is against all guidelines, improves outcome. The endpoint at 2 years, a reduction from 3.4 to 0.4 in non-culprit plaques, maintained over time. I don't think this will be the future, but certainly some local intervention may help. Now, the big player in the field is avoid full metal jacket, use a lot of drug-coated balloon, maybe part of their advantage, as you can see from this novel technique of imaging, near-infrared fluorescence, is to reduce inflammation. And you see that with paclitaxel coated balloon, you have a prolonged reduction in inflammation, while with simple PTA, this is only lasting for the first 4 weeks. So if I have to conclude on what imaging has added to our experience in interventional cardiology, I hope to have convinced you that has become an undiscussed standard of care, hopefully to be upgraded to class 1 indication, A, because there are multiple supporting trials to improve outcome of PCI, and that is a standard also in the use of large clinical trial to confirm mechanism, doses, effective doses, and strategy of various not only lipid-lowering therapies, but in general anti-atherosclerotic drugs such as anti-inflammatory and so forth. Identifying vulnerable plaque should never be a shortcut to stent everybody. That's exactly the opposite of what we should do, but certainly may help to stratify our patient and find the one who may benefit most from the newer, more expensive, sometimes prone to side effects treatments that we will mainly on the pharmacological side develop. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Carlo. It's really a comprehensive view of intracoronary imaging and what has provided in the last 30 years. You were in the beginning, you are still in the present. Pero si los stents habíamos mejorado en los 90 y pico con el iBus para implantarlos mejor y con más presión y lograr menos restenosis, aún así la restenosis de los stents metálicos, si recordamos, pues era más del 10% y sobre todo, y eso que no tratábamos lesiones muy complejas. Entonces ahí vino la lucha contra la restenosis y cosas como la braquiterapia, luego los stents farmacoactivos, y para ello tenemos a Manel Sabaté, bien conocido de todos. Él estudió medicina en Barcelona, ¿verdad, Manel? Hiciste la residencia en Belviche. Y luego pues pasó por Rotterdam también, estuvo en el Thorax Center. Manel spent a period of time with Patrick Sarris in Rotterdam, in Thorax Center, like many leaders in the interventional cardiology. Y después estuviste con Carlos en el Clínico de Madrid, o sea que has estado con ambos maestros. Y luego ya pues fuiste al Clínica Barcelona, donde has estado hasta ahora como responsable de cardiología intervencionista. Y bueno, pues Manel es un investigador nato con muchísimas publicaciones, ensayos, ha liderado muchos grandes proyectos que han sido landmark. Y la braquiterapia fue un entretenimiento en el que estuviste un periodo de tiempo, ¿verdad, Manel?
Pues muchas gracias y sobre todo en primer lugar gracias por la invitación. Para mí debo reconocer que ha sido, y lo comentaba antes con mis amigos, mis compañeros, que han sido unas charlas más complicadas, más difíciles de hacer, porque realmente aparte de que no hay mucha iconografía de la época, pues no teníamos smartphones para hacernos fotos como lo hacemos ahora, pues también darle el toque ese personal pues a veces es más complicado que simplemente hacer una charla puramente científica. A mí sí me gusta, y lo ha comentado Chema ya muy someramente, explicar un poco mi evolución, pero en este caso es absolutamente relevante. Como os ha comentado, me formé en Belviche, mis mentores en esa época, doctor Esplugas, doctor Zequier, pues me estimularon para ir a Rotterdam. Estuve ahí pues 2 años aprendiendo muchísimo bajo el paraguas del profesor Patrick Sarris. Y entonces ya era el tiempo, ya era época para volver. Ya no teníamos más opción de volver a España. Y en ese momento no había posibilidad de volver a Barcelona, no teníamos trabajo. En Barcelona entonces, en verano del año 99, estaba en Rotterdam trabajando y me llaman por teléfono y dice, tienes una llamada desde Madrid. Y se pone una chica, Andrea, si la conocéis, y dice, el doctor Macaya quiere hablar contigo. Entonces el doctor Macaya habló conmigo, yo claro, me sorprendió la llamada, no sabía quién era, pero no había hablado en mi vida con él. Y me ofreció trabajo en Madrid. Y fue, digamos, el motivo por el cual estuve aquí 6 años maravillosos y realmente también me cambió, como todo mi proceso, la vida. Y vine aquí efectivamente en el año 1999. En esa época, la cardiología intervencionista, pues bueno, ya se hacían muchas cosas, como hemos visto, ya se implantaban stents, todo se hacía por femoral. éramos expertos en comprimir femorales, los pseudoaneurismas de femorales con el eco, ¿no? Por las complicaciones que teníamos. Evidentemente había catéteres guía 6 French, tampoco era tan... Teníamos balones no compliantes. Teníamos balones de corte, no se llamaba Wolverine, se llamaba Flexton, o antes el cutting balloon de toda la vida, y había el rotablator, que ya existía y que casi no ha variado en 25 años, ahora hasta últimamente que ha cambiado un poco el pedal por un botón. Pero básicamente esto ya existía en esa época. Y también teníamos imagen, como hemos visto, pero con consolas bastante bulky, bastante enormes, ¿no? Aquí tenemos la consola de Boston y la consola de Volcano, que no Philips, ¿no? En esa época, y con las imágenes correspondientes a esa ecografía intracoronaria. Y teníamos stents, estos stents. Aquí tenemos ejemplos de stents de la época, stents convencionales, que en ese momento eran los stents metálicos, de acero inoxidable, el NIR. Luego el NIR apareció con unos calcetines a ambos lados para mejorar la fijación del stent, el VX Velocity, ¿no? De Cordis, el S670 de Medtronic, Biodivisio, el Tetra, antes del Penta, el Z, etcétera, de Abbott o de Guidant en esa época. Y con eso trabajábamos. Y el problema que teníamos, esta es una diapositiva clásica de Carlos, era doble. En primer lugar, el problema de la trombosis aguda de la arteria, que eso con el stent se solucionó. Y luego el problema de la restenosis, que inicialmente, como veis aquí, alrededor del 30% en la angioplastia con balón, pues con estos stents metálicos pues se redujo a la mitad, pues al 15% de manera global. Evidentemente, aquí en ese momento ya se pensaba que el futuro pues, tendría que pasar por algo más para conseguir reducir la restenosis. Y la verdad es que se probaron muchas cosas y todas fracasaban. Y aquí tenemos ejemplo de lo que se producía, la restenosis intrastent, pues en una diapositiva también clásica. En ese momento hacer diapositivas no era tan sencillo como ahora y tenías que, como sabéis, recortar el frame, colocarlo en un andamio para poderlo colocar en la máquina de diapositivas de la manera correcta para que salieran bien. Y estos son ejemplos de restenosis también difusa de stents que tampoco se suelen ver en este momento, ¿no? ¿Verdad? Y tenemos patrones de restenosis que a peor patrón, pues peor o mayor tasa de nueva revascularización o necesidad de cirugía. Pues bien, lo que sabíamos era que esto se debía a un exceso de crecimiento de tejido dentro del stent, lo que decíamos hiperplasia intimal. Y que en ese momento, pues aparte de fármacos que habían fracasado, se pensó que la radiación podía tener un papel porque se utilizaba ya en procesos benignos donde había mucha hiperplasia intimal. Entonces esto es lo que se empezó a trabajar y realmente fue lo que desarrollamos en estos últimos años de los años 90. Y realmente pues Carlos creyó también en la radiación y la quiso instalar o la quiso colocar aquí en España, concretamente en el Hospital Clínico San Carlos, y también vino a mi tesis doctoral, que fue en mayo del año 2000, un acto que no como en la Universidad de Barcelona, que es mucho más, digamos, menos solemne. Allí hay mucha solemnidad, un acto muy emblemático en el Erasmus University. Pues en pleno acto solemne, pues una de las preguntas que hizo Carlos, o la pregunta que hizo Carlos en ese momento, era quién iba a ganar esa noche. Porque esa noche jugaba el Barça contra el Valencia, que por cierto perdió el Barça, ¿no? Y luego el Valencia perdió la final con el Madrid, la Champions, ¿no? Pero recuerdo porque fue la pregunta que me hizo, a pesar de... Yo la contesté que querría que ganara el Barça, evidentemente, pero evidentemente no ganó ese año. Pero bueno, al menos sí que conseguimos tener la tesis sobre braquiterapia intracoronaria, ¿no? Y la quisimos traer a España, y la verdad que el proceso regulatorio, como muchas cosas, era muy complejo, pero además en este caso pues actuaba el Consejo de Seguridad Nuclear. Y aquí pues Carlos, evidentemente, como también tiene algún conocido en cualquier sitio, pues en el Consejo de Seguridad Nuclear también tenía conocidos y conseguimos que al menos todo el proceso de evaluación, inspección, etcétera, fuera bastante más rápido, a pesar de lo cual tardó un año, pero se consiguió llevar a cabo pues, la braquiterapia en España. Y recordar los sistemas iniciales eran sistemas de radiación beta, el sistema de Novoste o el sistema de Guidant, que no de Abbott en esa época, que era un balón centrado, a diferencia del sistema Novoste, que era un sistema no centrado de radiación beta. Pues efectivamente en 39 y en el 2000 pudimos hacer el primer caso de braquiterapia en el Hospital Clínico San Carlos. Y bien, hicimos cursos, hicimos casos en directo y realmente pues aquí encontré 2 CDs del curso que para ver el contenido tuve que utilizar un ordenador antiguo porque el nuevo ya no leía estos CDs, pero conseguí ver los casos que hacíamos en ese momento. Aquí vemos un caso con Patrick y con Héctor Villanueva, un fellow, y luego estaba dentro de la sala, si ahora hay ecocardiografistas, anestesistas, en esa época había radiooncólogos, José María Corral, o radiofísicos como Carlos Prieto, Eliseo Bañó, etc. Aquí otro caso que hizo Camino Bañuelos con Mauricio Zaragoza, Leo Rodríguez, pues de braquiterapia intracoronaria. Pero bien, eso sabíamos que era una técnica, pero que tenía sus complicaciones. Hicimos estudios aleatorizados, con ecografía, con un análisis muy pormenorizado de ecografía intracoronaria 3D, el aparato el Tomtec, también un gran aparato, un tocho de aparato para analizar esto. Y demostramos pues, que en lesiones de novo realmente, aunque reducía la restenosis del stent, producía un efecto borde muy importante, con lo cual no era, digamos, una solución buena para utilizarla después del stent convencional. Y además empezaron a salir los stents farmacoactivos, ¿no? De rapamicina, paclitaxel, la historia es bien conocida. Empezaron a ver todos los estudios clínicos de los stents farmacoactivos. En ese momento la lucha era Boston Cordis, paclitaxel versus sirolimus. La historia pues ya sabéis cuál ha sido a partir de entonces. También llevamos a cabo estudios a nivel nacional pues en pacientes diabéticos, donde demostramos que efectivamente este stent farmacoactivo pues, reducía la restenosis comparado con el stent convencional, que ahora parece muy evidente, pero en ese momento pues, no lo era tanto, y realmente fue gracias a la ayuda pues, de poder utilizar estos dispositivos súper caros en ese momento pues, a nivel de nuestro hospital, el Hospital Clínico San Carlos, ¿no? Y Carlos también en este estudio fue muy instrumental para poder conseguir llevarlo a cabo. También recuerdo que fuimos llamando a la puerta de varias compañías, a Boston no le interesó, pero luego conseguimos que Cordis le interesara y pudimos realizar el estudio pues, con este stent, el stent Cypher. Bien, también me gustaría remarcar, ya estoy acabando, pues que en esa época, a final del año 90 y principios de 2000, no existía el tratamiento del código de infarto de manera arreglada. Se hacía de manera, pues cuando se podía, evidentemente los traslados eran eternos y el tratamiento del infarto no estaba bien regulado y bien organizado. La iniciativa Stent for Life empezó cuando Carlos Macaya era presidente de la Sociedad Española de Cardiología y realmente fue uno de los impulsores de que se empezara a realizar o a implementar los códigos de infarto pues, a nivel de todas las comunidades nacionales. Y realmente el Stent for Life en España fue uno de los digamos, que lo avalaron y lo ayudaron para que se llevara a cabo con mucho éxito, como yo creo que se ha visto con los años, ¿no? Esto fue en el año 2010, o sea, una década después, pero fijaros que gracias a esto, pues toda la heterogeneidad de tratamiento del infarto, pues yo creo que ahora, en este momento, pues se ha podido homogeneizar a nivel de todo el territorio nacional. Finalmente, me gustaría concluir diciendo que el profesor Carlos Macaya básicamente ha estado en todos los saraos estos últimos 30 años. En cualquiera de los dispositivos, técnicas que se hayan implementado en España, él ha estado metido desde el principio y ha ayudado a su desarrollo. Ha formado y ha dirigido a muchas generaciones de cardiólogos e intervencionistas, que llevamos su impronta y su legado por todo el mundo. Recuerdo a Rosana, que seguro que está por aquí, que me decía, es que nosotros somos macallitos, ¿no? Pues nosotros somos macallitos, y aquí hay muchos macallitos que honramos pues, su nombre, ¿no? Y finalmente me gustaría agradecer pues, al equipo de cardiología intervencionista del Hospital San Carlos, en la época que estuve, estos 6 años maravillosos, del 99 al 2005, a Rosana, la jefa de sección en ese momento, Camino, Fernando, Javier, Antonio, Raúl. Había unos residentes, ¿no? Tuve el placer de tutorizar a Pilar y a Nieves, un equipo de enfermería también espléndido. Hemos visto antes a Marisa, a Carmen, a Fernanda, no quiero olvidarme de nadie, Teresa, en fin, a Mariluz, mucha gente, a auxiliares administrativas, Sara, a Andrea y a muchos fellows, muchos fellows de cardiología intervencionista que han pasado por allí, y todos yo creo que estamos orgullosos de haber tenido el placer de estar trabajando con Carlos Macaya. Muchas gracias y hasta siempre.
Muchas gracias, Manel, por estas memorias tan buenas y por esta trayectoria tan importante de la braquiterapia a los estentes farmacoactivos.